Okay, so before we get started today, I just want to talk a little bit about what's coming up in the next few weeks. Right, so tonight you have that Enthymeme assignment due, right, which is the last homework assignment you're going to be doing out of writing analytically for a while. Then you're going to be reading, right, chapter 5 for next time, and then chapter 6 for next Wednesday, after which we're going to start doing more complicated assignments, right? You're going to be reading some philosophy essays that I'm going to be giving to you and writing short analyses of those. So the skills that you'll need to do that are things we've been practicing in the homework, and by and large you guys have been doing pretty well with the homework, right? Not least of which, that most of you are getting it done, which is good. And, another thing I want to note too, that a few of you have been asking me for help with the homework, and that's good. Please do that, right? Those of you who ask for help typically do end up doing better than those who go it alone, right? So please, do feel free to ask me for help. I'm happy to do that. I'm happy to look over something for you before you turn it in. But just a couple of formal things to note as we move into these more complicated assignments. One thing that I've noticed a lot of you are not doing on the homework from now on, I do want everybody to double space all submissions, please. Now, this is partly my fault. I should have stated that I wanted this from the beginning, but it's really hard to read a great big chunk of single space text, right? So this is just one of those things you do to make life a little easier for your reader. And I'm not asking this question to be condescending. I have found that people sometimes genuinely don't know. Does everybody understand what I mean by double spacing? Right? Essentially what this means, right, is there should be a space between every line in your submitted assignment. You can usually go up to the paragraph tab in whatever word processor you're using and set it to do this automatically. But yeah, just make sure that those separated lines are there, right? Secondly, please, 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 separate your ideas into paragraphs. This also makes things easier for your reader to understand, right? It helps you keep related ideas together, right? I am going to discuss all ideas related to this topic in this paragraph, and then start a new paragraph when I move on to another topic, right? And essentially that's what that paragraph shift is. It's a signpost for your reader, letting him or her know that you're changing direction slightly now, right? That you're moving on to something else. So please make sure that when we start getting to the slightly longer assignments that you are doing this. Does anybody have any questions? No? Okay, great. Does anybody have any questions about the Enthymeme assignment that's due tonight? Yeah, Jamie.
Every now and then I'm trying to distinguish, can Enthymeme could be a quote, for example, in the movie Predator, if it bleeds, we can kill it. Could that be considered Enthymeme? Because if it bleeds, implying it's wounded, and it's wounded, it can die.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, that's something that would work. Here's one thing that actually kind of relates to what we're doing today that you can do to test whether or not something is an enthymeme, right? An enthymeme will always make a claim, right? It'll always be trying to convince you of something, right? There's always an argument embedded in it. This is one of the reasons I suggested looking at advertising, right? Because advertising, by its very nature, it is attempting to persuade, right? So if it's not making any kind of claim, then it's not an enthymeme. So the statement that you brought up, the quote from Predator that you brought up, yeah, that makes a claim, right? If it bleeds, we can kill it. Right? That's an arguable proposition. Somebody floated me like an example from an old UB40 song that was an example of symbolism. Right? There's an implied symbol there, but it's not making a claim. An enthymeme always has to make a claim. If it's not making a claim of some kind, it's not an enthymeme. Any other questions about the enthymeme assignment? Okay, so how are we overall then on the distinction between a claim and evidence? If I ask you to make a claim, what am I asking? Or if I say this particular statement is a claim, what am I saying about it?
It has like a point, like an argument.
Yeah, it's trying to convince me of something, right? So a claim, is this something that's necessarily is this something that's going to be true on its own? If something is true on its own, do I have to convince you of it? No, if it's true on its own, it's simply a fact, right? So a claim is any statement that requires some sort of backing in order to convince or persuade, right? So logically, then, what is evidence? Yeah, evidence is more or less factual data that can be used either to back up a claim or to generate a claim, right? Depending on whether you're arguing deductively or inductively. Does everybody remember the difference between deductive and inductive reasoning? What's a deductive argument? What am I doing if I'm reasoning deductively?
You have a general idea and more specifics that work back to it.
Exactly, yeah. So deduction is arguing from a general principle, working your way down to specifics, right? Here is this general category I wish to define. These are the things these are the features I think are in this category, right? That's a form of deductive logic. So inductive logic, inductive argument then follows what pattern?
Ideas.
Yeah, you start with the data, you start with the evidence, right? And you use that to generate a claim. So when you're reasoning deductively, you're usually starting with a claim and then picking evidence to back that up, right? When you reason inductively, you are starting with a body of evidence and you're using that evidence to come up with a claim, right? So most of the reasoning you are going to have to do as university students is going to be inductive, right? Rarely are you going to be given a claim that you have to use evidence to prove. Usually you're going to have to generate the claim yourself based on the evidence that's given to you, right? So evidence is more or less factual data. So just to give you a quick example here. All right, Andrew Jackson, the guy on the $20 bill, behaved towards Native Americans in a racist manner. Now, would this be evidence or claim? This would be a claim because I'd have to provide data to demonstrate this, right? I would have to provide data to back this up. I can't just go saying something like this about someone without proof, right? Without something to back it up. So, if I then say, he moved the Cherokee from Georgia to Oklahoma and gave their land to white settlers, now is that claim or evidence? That would be evidence, right? Now, if I wanted to demonstrate, to actually try to prove a claim this large, right, I would probably need a larger body of evidence, right? I would need to show some kind of pattern of behavior. I'm just trying to give you an example here of the distinction between claim and evidence, right? So the claim is the thing of which I'm trying to persuade you. The evidence is the data I'm using to try to persuade you, right? Now, I'm going to give you a quick example here from a student paper I got a few semesters ago. I won't name who it's from, but we'll just, we'll just show this to you. And you tell me what's the claim and what's the evidence, okay? All cities should require citizens to purchase firearms They passed a law in Kennesaw, and it worked out great. What's the claim and what's the evidence?
Stating that they should require citizens to purchase firearms is a claim.
That's a claim, right? Yeah.
And then there's like a brief evidence that it worked out great. It's not like
That's an
factual
affirmative.
evidence.
Yeah, this isn't really evidence either, right? This is also a claim, right? Now, if you wanted to prove that it worked out great, right, then what would you need to provide? Yeah, you need to, provide some statistics, right? Okay, that this actually reduced crime, right? Or that, that there was some positive impact from this, right? So yeah, so you need to be very, very careful about distinguishing between claim and evidence, right? Not everything that you think is evidence is always going to be evidence. So make sure that every claim that you make, everything you say that is not out and out true on its own, is backed up with some sort of factual information. Now, you are also usually going to have to explain what the logical link is between the claim you're making and the evidence you're using to make it. Because that's not always going to be clear to your reader, right? A lot of different pieces of evidence can be interpreted in multiple ways. Right, so let's try a couple of examples here, right? I'll put a claim and a piece of evidence up on the board. You tell me what's the claim, what's the evidence, and you explain to me what the logical link is, okay? All right, so the first one we're going to try is from a book by George Orwell called The Road to Wigan Pier. Any of you ever read Animal Farm in 1984? Okay, some of you probably had to read it in school, right? Okay, so middle-class people are fond of saying that minors wouldn't wash themselves properly even if they could. But this is nonsense. where pithead bats, that is bats that are right at the mine, exist, practically all the men use them. All right, so what's the claim?
Miners wouldn't wash themselves properly.
Is that the claim Orwell is actually making, that the miners wouldn't wash themselves properly even if they could?
No, that's what most people are fond of saying.
Yeah, he's saying that this is a claim other people make, right? And what is he trying to do to their claim?
Is it wrong?
To disprove it, right? We see this with the "but this is nonsense," right? Right? Middle class people are fond of saying that miners wouldn't wash themselves properly even if they could. Bullshit, right? And here's the evidence, right? Where pithead bats exist, practically all the men use them, right? So because he can demonstrate that when given the opportunity, in fact, the miners do wash themselves, right? He's proving his claim correct and the claims of his opponents wrong, right? Okay. Let's try another one. This is from an essay by the cultural critic Walter Benjamin called "The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction." Okay. The Greeks knew only two procedures of technically reproducing works of art: founding and stamping. Mechanical reproduction of a work of art represents something new. Right, so mechanical reproduction, which is using a machine to make many copies at once, right? So what's the claim here and what's the evidence?
The claim, I think, is the bottom statement and the evidence is on the top.
Okay, why would you say that, Carly?
Because, like, on the bottom, I mean, people can have different opinions of, like, the mechanical reproduction, but the top one sounds more like facts that really is just what the Greeks knew.
Yeah, this is the thing of which he's trying to convince you, right? That making multiple copies of a work of art by machine is something new. It's something people have only just started doing. And he is trying to demonstrate this by going back to an ancient culture, right, that only knew two ways of reproducing works of art that are things that are slow processes that you have to do by hand, right? So mechanical reproduction of a work of art represents something new, right? This is what he's trying to convince you of, and this is a verifiable fact that you could look up, right? You could look this up to see whether it's true or not. All right, let's try one more of these. This is from a book by the psychoanalyst and anti-colonial theorist Frantz Fanon called "Black Skin, White Masks." In the French colonial army, the black officers serve, first of all, as interpreters. The colonized is elevated above his status in proportion to his adoption of the mother country's cultural standards. All right, what's the evidence, what's the claim? Which of these is something you could look up and verify?
The top statement.
Yeah, the top statement you could look up and see if it's true, right? What about the bottom statement?
Can you like look at the bottom statement too then?
Well, he's trying to convince you of something here, right? Essentially, he's trying to convince you that in order to advance in the French colonial army, right, that black officers had to adopt French cultural standards. That's something that's a little bit harder to attach to a particular set of data points, right? So that's why he's giving you this verifiable piece of information, right? Because they have to serve as interpreters in order to become officers, right? That means they have to speak good French, which means that they then have, they have to assimilate to some extent in order to advance in the colonial army, right? Does that make sense? Do we see how this is the claim and this is the evidence? Right, this is the thing he's trying to persuade you of. This is what he's using to try to back that up. Now, we've talked a little bit here about connecting logic between points, right? Yeah, Bentley.
So more than not, I mean, I know it's not always like this, but several of the examples, the evidence has been first and then comes the claim after that. It's like they're setting you up for a claim about the man.
Yeah, it's not always going to be like where there's a topic sentence that's the master claim for the paragraph, and then the evidence is just going to follow that. Sometimes the evidence is going to come before the claim that they're trying to make, right? So that's something always to look out for when you're reading, right? That it doesn't always follow a predictable pattern. Now, when you guys are writing, it would be best to follow more or less predictable patterns, right? In particular, you want to try to maintain balance within a paragraph.
I feel like when the evidence comes before, it's just, you almost lose interest because it's like pointless information to you until you get to the claim they're making. Because then you got to go back and look at the evidence after you've seen the claim.
Sure, yeah. And that's one of the reasons why a lot of writing instructors will tell you to try to start a paragraph with a topic sentence that makes the big claim that you're trying to make in that paragraph, right? You might make other claims within the paragraph as well, but it's always a good idea to make sure that the main point that you're trying to make with the paragraph is clear to your reader from the beginning, right? So try to balance within a paragraph between evidence and claim. I would say probably a good, this is not a hard and fast rule. There are very few hard and fast rules in writing, but a paragraph is about 2/3 evidence and 1/3 claim is probably about right? You generally want to have a little bit more evidence than you have claim, right? Because sometimes you're going to need multiple pieces of evidence to support a particular claim. Okay, any further questions about this before I proceed? Okay, so as I was saying about sort of linking your evidence to your claim, right? The logic you use to get from evidence to claim isn't always going to be immediately clear to your reader. So one means for testing your own thinking when you're trying to get from evidence to claim is called the Toolman Method of argument. Now we are just going to work with a very simplified form of this, right? In its full form, this has about 6 components. We're only going to use 3, right? We're only going to use half of them. Because frankly, for our purposes, all 6 aren't necessary. So, an argument for Toolman, it's named for a philosopher of language named Stephen Toolman, has 3 basic parts. Right? A claim, grounds, and a warrant. Right? Grounds means what we would call evidence or data. The warrant is the connecting logic between the claim and the grounds, right? The reason why the grounds support the claim. So, if I make the claim, right, I am a U.S. citizen. My grounds for this are I was born in Pennsylvania. So what then is my warrant for connecting the grounds to the claim?
Pennsylvania is a part of the United States.
Yeah, Pennsylvania is part of the U.S., and anyone born on U.S. soil is a U.S. citizen, right? According to I think it's the 14th Amendment, right? Right, there are other grounds I could use to make the same claim, right? For that, that my parents were citizens or what have you, right? But I'm just trying to again demonstrate how the model works. All right, so let's try a couple more of these. I'm going to preface this first one by saying that I actually know jack shit about baseball, so I have no idea which teams are good and which are not, right? I just chose this particular team because my dad was from Detroit and this was his favorite team. I have no idea whether they're any good or not. Okay, so, claim. The Tigers will win the World Series this year. My grounds. They have the best pitching staff in the league. Again, don't know if this is true. But bear with me for the sake of example. What's my warrant for connecting this claim to this grounds?
Having a picture to a team.
Yeah, that a team with the team with the best pitching staff is the team that's going to win, right? Right, that it's pitching that wins baseball games. That's the logical connection. Okay, let's try another one. I think the next Democratic Party convention will be held in Charlotte. My grounds for thinking this are that North Carolina is a state the Democrats need to win. So what will be my warrant for linking this claim and this grounds?
By holding the convention in North Carolina, it'll give them better standing.
Yeah, that the convention should be held in a state you need to win, right?
So basically, like, the warrant is more so like the evidence, like what makes it true, almost.
Well, it's what makes the evidence
It's explaining
back up
it.
the claim. Yeah, exactly. It's the logical link between the evidence and the claim. That's what the warrant is. Does that make sense? Okay. Should be held in a state the party must win.
It's kind of like when somebody gets a warrant out, search somebody's place or something like that, like you see on TV.
Yeah,
The reason and why they can search that place.
exactly. Yeah, the warrant provides the police officer essentially license to search a place he wouldn't normally be allowed to, right? So it's the logical link between the action and something you did, right? Okay, one more. All right, my claim is that Beowulf, the poem, not the stupid animated movie, not good, shows a culture in transition from warrior-focused paganism to Christianity. My grounds, my evidence for believing this, is that the poem juxtaposes sympathetic portrayals of pagan warriors with warnings against pagan practices. So, in order to connect this evidence with this claim, what do I have to believe about literature or art or culture in general?
That it shows us a culture. That like
Yeah, I would have to believe that art and literature express the values of a particular culture. Okay. Everybody's got this? Okay, so we're going to try a little something else here now. There are two things I want you to do as I show you this little video clip. The first thing I want you to do is think about what claim each character is making. And what evidence is used to back up these claims? Now, the third thing I want you to pay attention to has nothing to do directly with claim and evidence, but does have a lot to do with interpretation. Right? I want you to look for binary oppositions in the clip, right? Ideas and attitudes that are clearly opposed to each other, right? This will give us a good idea of what's at stake in the dispute between these two characters, right? So look at differences between the two characters, look at differences in the way they express themselves, right? Look at differences in the object they're arguing over, that sort of thing. any kind of paired opposites you can find. And when I say, by the way, what claim does each character make, I'm not necessarily talking about the 100% obvious claim that both of them are making, right? There's another claim each of them are making underneath that that's a little more subtle. Try to dig that out. Okay, right. Let's go off. Projector goes on.
Hello, I wish to register a complaint. Hello, miss? What do you mean, miss? I'm sorry, I have a cold. I wish to make a complaint. Oh, sorry, we're closing for lunch. Never mind that, my lad. I wish to complain about this pallet. What I purchased not half an hour ago from this very boutique. Oh, yes, the Norwegian blue. What's wrong with it? I'll tell you what's wrong with it, my lad. It's dead. That's what's wrong with it. No, it's sick. It's resting, look. Look, my lad, I know a dead parrot when I see one, and I'm looking at one right now. No, that's not dead, it's resting. Resting? Yeah, resting. Remarkable bird, the Norwegian blue, isn't it? Beautiful plumage. The plumage don't enter into it. It's stone dead. No, it's resting. All right then, if it's resting, I'll wake it up. Hello, Polly! I've got a nice fresh cuttlefish for you if you wake up, Mr. Polly Ballard! Gary, move. No, you didn't. That was you pushing the cage. I didn't. Yes, you did. Hello, Polly! Wakey, wakey! Rise and shine! This is your 9 o'clock alarm call! Now that's what I call a dead parrot. No, he's stunned. Stunned? Yeah, you stunned him just as he was waking up. Norwegian blue stunned easily. Oh, I don't know this. That parrot is definitely deceased. And when I brought it not half an hour ago, you assured me that its total lack of movement was due to it being tired and shagged out after a long squall. Oh, he's pining for the field. Pining for the fields? What kind of talk is that? Look, why did it fall flat on its back the moment I got it home? Oh, well, the Norwegian blue prefers keeping on its back. Beautiful plumage. Look, I took the liberty of examining that parrot. And I discovered that the only reason that it had been sitting on its perch in the first place was that it had been nailed there. Oh, well, of course it was nailed there. I mean, if I hadn't nailed it there, it would have muscled up those bars and boom! Oh, yeah, mate. This parrot wouldn't boom if you put 4,000 volts through it. It's bleeding demised. No, it's pining. It's not pining. It's passed on. This parrot is no more. It has ceased to be. It's expired and gone to see its maker. This is a late parrot. It's aged, bereft of life. It rests in peace. If you hadn't nailed it to the perch, you would be pushing up the daisies. It's run down the curtain and joined the choir invisible. This is an ex-parrot. Well, I better replace it then. If you want to get anything done in this country, you've got to complain to go blue in the nose. Sorry, Squire, I've had a lot, but I got the parrots. I see, I get the picture. I've got a slug. Does it talk? Not really. But it's scarcely a replacement then, is it? Listen, I didn't want to work in a pet shop. I wanted to be a lumberjack. I'm sorry, this is irrelevant, isn't it?
Okay, so let's talk first about question 3 here. Right? What are some of the oppositions that you notice here?
One's the storekeeper and one's the one that bought it.
Okay, yeah, we have the big binary here. Yeah, shopkeeper, customer, right? Good. And let's try to pick each of these guys apart a little bit.
One that bought the parrots, more real.
What do you mean by more real?
He's sees something for what it is, and the other guy's being in like denial about it.
Okay. Here's the question I would raise to that, though, right? Which one of them bought a dead parrot in the first place? Right. So the customer seems to be arguing from reality, right? Arguing using genuine physical evidence, but he was fooled by the shopkeeper having nailed the parrot to the perch, right? And just saying that it was just tired and that it missed the fjords, right? So on the one hand, while the customer does seem to be dealing in reality, while the shopkeeper's giving him an illusion, or really more kind of a line of bullshit, right? He is still the one who bought a dead parrot in the first place. What else do we notice about differences between these two characters? How else are they different from each other?
The shopkeeper keeps, changing his reasoning why the parrot looks dead, and
Okay.
the other guy's pretty precise about he's dead.
Yeah, the shopkeeper is always trying to change the subject, right? To the point where at the end of their exchange, when it's clear that he's lost, he starts talking about something else entirely. Right? He's like, "Look, mate, I didn't want to work in a pet shop. I wanted to be a lumberjack," right? Which has nothing to do with the argument. Whereas, yeah, the customer sticks to his guns. Good. What else do we notice about the differences between these two characters? How else are they presented as opposites?
The shopkeeper's calm and the customer's angry.
Okay. Calm, but also a little shifty, right? His eyes are always darting back and forth when he's lying. But he seems pretty confident through most of this that he's going to get out of this, right? What about the way they talk? Are there differences in the way these two characters talk?
Shopkeeper has kind of a Cockney accent, while the customer has a posh Londoner accent.
Yeah, the shopkeeper sounds more working class, right? While the customer sounds a little bit, yeah, as you put it, more posh. That's a very good word for it. What about in terms of their vocabulary? Like, just like apart from the accent?
The customer had a lot bigger vocabulary.
Yeah, he uses bigger words, right? He is always finding synonyms for dead parrot. It's run down the curtain and join the choir invisible, right? Some of these are very colorful. This is an ex-parrot. Whereas the shopkeeper keeps saying the same things over and over again, right? The customer is being relatively honest, but is like, really, what ought to be one of our first clues that the shopkeeper is a liar?
That he nailed the parrot.
Like, well, even before that, right? I mean, what's he keep calling the parrot?
Norwegian blue.
A Norwegian blue, right? Do parrots live in Norway?
I didn't even hear it really good, so I couldn't tell what they were saying.
Yeah,
I don't understand.
parrots are tropical, right? Parrots are not commonly found in Scandinavia, right? They do not pine for the fjords. So he's just making shit up, right? He doesn't really know what he's talking about. And yet, which of the two of them is going to get the better of the exchange? The shopkeeper's going to win, right? Why?
You got the money for it.
Yeah. He's already got the customer's money. And his deflecting tactics actually seem to be working, right? He manages to get out of replacing the parrot by just not having one, right? Sorry, Squire, fresh out of parrots. Would you like a slug? So what assumption then underlies the customer's complaint? What is the customer assuming ought to happen in this case?
Get some kind of reimbursement or, something to replace it. Something to be
Yeah.
done about him selling a dead parrot.
Exactly, yeah, that if you buy, like, the assumption underlying the whole argument, right, is that if you buy defective merchandise from somebody, then it's that person's responsibility to either refund your money or replace it, right? And do both of them actually seem to basically accept this assumption? Yeah, the shopkeeper's trying to get out of it, right? And part of the humor in the scene is is based on his attempts to not have to fulfill his obligation in the social contract, right? To get to keep the customer's money and not actually give him anything. Which, if you've ever actually worked in customer service, that's kind of what you're expected to do. I worked for about a year in online customer service in WeightWatchers.com. And yeah, customer service is not about serving the customer; it's about loss prevention.
Yeah.
It's about keeping that customer paying. But I digress. Okay, so then getting back to the assumption, then, like, really, what is the basic claim that each of these guys is trying to advance?
The other one is wrong, and the other one doesn't know what they're talking about. They're both trying to prove each other wrong.
They are both trying to prove each other wrong, right? But what does the customer think should happen?
That the parrot's dead and he should be reimbursed in some way.
Yeah, that's the claim, right? That's the argument he's trying to make, right? I should be reimbursed. And what then is the claim the shopkeeper is making?
That you bought it in the first place, it's not really his responsibility.
Yep, the shopkeeper's claim is some version of not my problem, right? And yet, in the face of all of the evidence that the customer offers, what evidence does the customer offer to back up his claims?
Throws the bird on the ground.
Okay, yeah.
Like, beats the bird in the helmet.
He demonstrates the bird's total unresponsiveness, right? Although, is that conclusive evidence that the bird was dead when he bought it?
There was a nail to the perch.
Yeah, now that is stronger evidence that the bird was already dead when he bought it, right? He says he bought the bird half an hour ago. It's entirely conceivable that the bird could have died in the half hour from which he took it from the shop, right? And that it isn't necessary that isn't necessary. The bird's unresponsiveness isn't necessarily the shopkeeper's fault. However, yeah, the feet nailed to the perch. That's more conclusive, right? It's like, yeah, I definitely didn't do that. And that's not something that a live parrot would probably let you do. Unless heavily sedated, right? When I lived in New York, I used to play in a band, and at the rehearsal space that we rented, there was the owner had a parrot that he kept there. His name was Mikey, and Mikey was this vicious creature which probably came from living in a rehearsal studio where people were making noise all the goddamn time. But yeah, like if you got too close to Mikey's cage, like he would lunge at you and try to take your fingers off, right? So yeah, a live parrot is probably not going to let you nail its feet. to its perch. Even one that's friendlier than Mikey the parrot, right? Now, does the shopkeeper have any genuine evidence for his position?
That it missed the wherever he said he was
Yeah,
going
as
to.
if it's right. It's lonely for Norway, right? It's pining for the fjords, right? But he doesn't have any evidence that that is really verifiable, right? All of his evidence really kind of comes down to claims. Once again, right? He has a series of claims, right? Norwegian blue prefers keeping on its back, right? Oh, it's pining for the fjords. If I hadn't nailed it to the perch, it would have muscled up to those bars and boom, right? Pretty much everything that he says is a claim. He has no evidence he can produce that the customer is wrong. He has no evidence that the bird was alive when the customer bought it. Right, so on the merits of the argument here, right, who really ought to win? Yeah, points should go here to the customer, right? And yet the shopkeeper still seems to manage to squeeze out a victory. So which side of this shopkeeper-customer binary do you think the sketch actually favors?
Shopkeeper.
Why would you say the shopkeeper, Bentley?
Because, like we said, the customer should have won the argument, but the shopkeeper won in the end.
Yeah, on the sole merits of the argument, this ought to go to the customer. But the shopkeeper is clever enough to constantly knock the customer off guard, right? And constantly delay and defer having to do the things society expects him to do, right? So how might we relate that to some of the characteristics that we noted about each of these characters? What argument might this sketch be implicitly making about these characters? Who are we supposed to like more? The posh customer?
The shopkeeper.
Or why would you say the shopkeeper?
Because it's more like us. It's like we relate more to the shopkeeper more so because it's like we're middle class and stuff like that, and we're not everyone's as educated as posh as he.
Yeah, by making the customer a higher social class than the shopkeeper, right? It makes it seem almost as though the customer is picking on someone of a lower class, right? By showing off his learning and his vocabulary, the customer is actually losing our sympathy, right? Well, the pet shop guy's just trying to make a living, right?
Yeah,
He doesn't even want to work in a pet shop.
I think it shows too because it's like the shopkeeper was just trying to sell the bird,
Yeah.
make money for himself, and like he said he wanted to be a
Lumberjack.
lumberjack,
Yeah.
which I mean
Yeah.
obviously so he's not doing what he wants to, whereas the customer bought the bird for like his benefit, like it's just something extra.
Yeah. No, I mean, yeah, nobody really needs a parrot, right?
And it's kind of ironic that he bought a dead parrot, but he's supposed to be played as like the more educated person.
Right.
Yep. That's the big kicker there too. Is he's depicted as smarter and more educated, but he bought a dead bird. Yeah. He paid money for an obviously dead parrot.
Maybe common sense isn't there.
So yeah, so like if we're actually like trying to make a kind of preliminary thesis out of something like this, right? This is exactly the kind of work we need to do, right? We dig into these big oppositions, the assumptions the scene makes to figure out what's at stake, right? What ideas are at play against each other in the scene, and which ideas does the scene seem to favor? So we could then come up with a preliminary thesis, a preliminary claim that is something along these lines, right? While the customer is clearly the party with facts on his side, his posh accents and loud shouting at the shopkeeper make us sympathize with the working class trickster despite his dishonesty. So what we've done here is basically used inductive reasoning, right, to come up with a preliminary argument about this set of data. Right? We watched the scene, we picked apart all these details, and from those details, right, looking at the way those details interacted with each other, we came up with the beginning of an argument, right? This is what I'm going to want you guys to be doing with pretty much everything we read from here on out, right? Starting with the philosophy essays that we're going to start reading, I guess, not this week or next week, but the week after, because we only meet once next week, right? I think we only meet on Wednesday. Next Monday's Labor Day, yeah. Okay, yeah. So, I know, yeah, time flies, right? Yeah. So, there is no specific homework assignment for tonight, right? I'm going to let you guys go a little bit early again. Remember, you're going to be reading chapter 5 for next time. We'll do some exercises on Wednesday, and chapter 6 for Monday, right? Not for Monday, for next Wednesday, because we don't meet on Wednesday. All right, so get those enthymemes into me by tonight, and we'll see you in 2 days.